What horrors hid behind the towering walls of Victorian asylums? These places promised safety, yet many who entered never came out. Dark corridors echoed with cries no one dared answer. Treatments were cruel, secrets even crueler. By the end of this journey, you will uncover the single, chilling truth that kept these institutions alive. Not to heal, but to feed on the forgotten. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Birth of the Victorian Asylum. Early 19th century Britain smelled of coal and wet stone. Cities grew like open wounds, factories sprouting chimneys that belched smoke into narrow streets. People flowed from countryside to towns in search of work, and the old rhythms of village life splintered. Poverty stacked families into cramped rooms, and hunger became a constant companion. The modern city made the mind fragile. Without steady rhythms and familiar faces, nerves frayed quickly. Blooms of despair and agitation did not fit in tidy municipal plans. Streets thrummed with strangers and with new kinds of desperation that had once been contained by kinship and local habit. Where communities once cared for one another, industrial anonymity left the vulnerable adrift. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. The asylum arrived like a promise to many who watched the city expand and strain. Architects drew airy facades and landscaped grounds to soothe public anxiety. Reformers spoke of science, of humane care, of shelter from the chaos of the street. Gentle routines, fresh air, and kind attendance became the gospel of a new age. Philanthropists and civic leaders embraced the language of cure and progress. Boards were formed, funds raised, and brick followed ideal. These institutions were pitched as sanctuaries where reason could be coaxed back to those who had lost it. Local newspapers ran glowing accounts of promenades and conservatory walks meant to restore spirit through nature and order. The rhetoric of reform made it easy to imagine that the lunatic problem had found a humane solution. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Anxiety and hope collided with the harsh arithmetic of cost. Asylums were expensive to build and expensive to staff. From the first year's optimism met the unglamorous problems of maintenance, food, and warmth. Wards filled more quickly than benefactors could provide for them. The small therapeutic communities imagined by reformers expanded into institutions housing scores of souls. With more bodies came logistical strain and a decline in the promised personalization of care. Attendants, often poorly paid, struggled against exhaustion and the grind of routines that once promised solace. The machinery of administration favored stability over experimentation, and the patient lists lengthened while the hands to tend them remained thin. Local parishes, eager to remove visible disorder from streets and markets, began to rely on the asylum as a functional sink for social problems. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. The asylum movement did not exist in a moral vacuum. It was entangled with politics and social control. Local authorities used institutions to manage visible poverty and to ease social tensions in public spaces. Displacing the distressed from streets into institutions removed the spectacle of disorder from markets and civic life, smoothing appearances for property owners and voters. Wealthy sponsors found moral comfort and public recognition when donating funds. Their names on building facades signaled civic benevolence, even as day-to-day care passed to clerks and attendants. The law provided mechanisms for commitment that were often quick and administrative, and magistrates could sign orders with scant oversight. The asylum thus became a political tool, useful for preserving public order, for concealing private shame, and for reinforcing the social hierarchies that the age depended upon. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Patients who entered asylums arrived with whole lives behind them, yet institutions often erased those stories. Casebooks began with narrative notes about family, work, trauma, and health. Over time, those narratives were compressed into clinical shorthand that defined identity more than past history did. Labels stuck. A handwritten note of melancholia or mania became a title that shaped daily treatment and social interactions inside the ward. Where personal names once defined a person, diagnoses and numbers took over. Work prescribed as therapy often stripped away meaningful occupation, turning days into tasks that met institutional needs more than individual rehabilitation. Correspondence with home dwindled under the pressure of bureaucracy and distance. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. The public rarely heard the unarranged voices within asylum walls. Visits were curated, and public relations mattered. Those who financed or inspected institutions were shown the best wards, the best-dressed attendants, the best-behaved patients. A guided visit could create an impression of success and gentleness even when reality differed widely. Behind closed doors, there were corridors no visitor saw, and rooms where privacy disappeared. Intimate suffering often became a matter for daily clerks and attendants rather than a subject for polite society. Families were told that commitment might rescue a loved one, and many consented in hope or desperation, unaware that years could pass with little meaningful oversight. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Early treatment philosophies carried a moral framework that promised recovery through compassion and structure. Moral treatment emphasized dignity, occupation, and regularity rather than force. It rejected older, more violent practices and proposed a therapeutic environment to restore minds. In practice, however, the pressure of numbers and the occasional crisis of violence exposed the gap between theory and execution. When patients resisted, became unpredictable, or posed a threat, attendants often reverted to seclusion or coercion in the name of safety. Good intentions frayed under stress, and what began as humane design sometimes hardened into routine discipline. Medical authority, fragile and evolving, balanced ideals against pragmatic decisions that prioritized containment. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Designers and administrators learned to weaponize space. Architectural choices shaped behavior and experience. Long corridors allowed supervision without interaction. High walls and fences separated patients from the town and made escape rare. Windows admitted light but often limited sight of neighboring streets and lives. Separate wings enforced segregation by gender, class, and diagnosis as a matter of everyday order. Observation rooms allowed staff to turn bodies and expressions into clinical notes without reciprocal recognition. Even gardens were organized to keep movement predictable and visible to staff. The built environment communicated hierarchy as eloquently as any regulation. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Money directed more than medicine. Boards and governors, often made of local elites, shaped priorities. Donors prized visible prestige and reliable management of funds. That preference meant that expenditures often favored construction and outward presentation, while staff wages, training, and patient comforts received less attention. Kitchens, laundries, and maintenance wings bore the brunt of budget cuts, and patient diets and bedding reflected fiscal constraints. Reputation mattered for attracting further endowments, so facades and reception rooms gained greater care than the wards where the most vulnerable lived. Economic decisions became medical realities. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Small acts of resistance and occasional advocacy chipped at the monolith of institutional power. Attendants who sympathized smuggled comforts or protected personal letters. Relatives petitioned courts and pressed magistrates for reviews and releases, sometimes prevailing when a sympathetic official took an interest. Midwives, local doctors, and clergy on occasion refused to accept institutionalization as the only option for certain cases and argued for care that kept people within their communities. Journalists and reformers, when they gained access, published accounts that made public what had been hidden. These voices would slowly erode complacency and force conversations about oversight and compassion, though change was often painfully slow. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Misdiagnosis and wrongful confinement became common tragedies within that system. Definitions of madness were malleable and could be stretched to fit social convenience. Women whose behavior threatened patriarchal norms could be labeled hysterical and sent away. Men who resisted local authorities or who lived in abject poverty were vulnerable to being described as dangerous. Diagnoses often ignored trauma, grief, or understandable responses to grim circumstances. Once inside, patients faced bureaucracy and routines that could make recovery harder than the original ailment. Registers recorded names and dates while the fuller truths of life outside the walls faded into absence. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. As the century closed, the zeal that birthed asylums met public scrutiny and legal change. Reports and testimonies forced conversations about overcrowding, staff training, and rights of the confined. Laws evolved to require periodic review, and advocates pushed for better inspections and clearer commitments to rehabilitation. Some institutions reworked spaces to allow more humane contact and more trained staff, and a few transformed into hospitals that emphasized therapy over containment. Yet institutional momentum remained powerful. The political and economic logics that had launched the asylum proved stubborn and adaptable. Even reform could be partial, and the shadow of containment lingered in practice and memory. The consequences of these choices would ripple through families and neighborhoods and shape how future generations understood care. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Control. Victorian asylum facades rose like promises of order, brick and stone speaking of civic pride and moral purpose. Approaching one could feel the weight of intent, the building asserting authority over a chaotic city beyond its gates. Symmetry and grand entrances projected charity and science, a public gesture that reassured donors and magistrates. Gardens, conservatories, and tree-lined drives softened the image for visiting benefactors while concealing the functions within. Behind the pleasant exterior, plans were drawn to separate, observe, and regulate the people who would live there. Architects balanced aesthetics and surveillance, knowing that a respectable facade made it easier to normalize confinement. In this way, impressive exteriors became a form of social camouflage, promising cure while quietly training occupants to accept their new roles inside institutional routines. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Corridors served as the arteries of institutional life, long and narrow routes that directed bodies past observation points and nurses' stations. Designers used axial plans to keep sightlines open so staff could monitor movement with as little physical intervention as possible. High ceilings and hard floors amplified sound, making disturbances audible far away while reducing chances for private conversation or concealment. Doors opened onto ward clusters like cabins on a ship, each threshold demarcating zones of visibility and restriction. Lighting and window placement were calibrated to reveal motion and faces rather than to invite views outward. The hall became a device of counting and accounting, a place where presence could be confirmed and absence noted. In that ordinary geometry, patients learned when they could be seen and when they were expected to disappear into silence, a lesson taught daily by the building itself. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Observation rooms and galleries converted human behavior into clinical material, spaces where looking replaced listening and where gestures were interpreted as symptoms. Large glazed partitions and raised galleries allowed staff to watch patients without reciprocal recognition, turning interpersonal moments into data points for casebooks. The built environment made anonymity routine. Eyes observed from above while faces below were cataloged without the reassurance of returned attention. That dynamic shaped diagnosis as much as medical theory did, because being watched altered the very behaviors under scrutiny. Patients adapted to perform stability for observers and to hide or suppress reactions that would attract intervention. The architecture manufactured a clinical gaze, training staff to rely on visible signs and measurable actions rather than on sustained conversation. That gaze could validate decisions about confinement and treatment while masking the human costs of being constantly visible. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Segregation by gender, class, and presumed disorder was not incidental, but a structural principle in many Victorian asylums, reproduced in corridors, staircases, and separate wings. Men and women lived in different quarters, with women often under stricter moral supervision and subject to paternalistic judgments about their behavior. Wealthier patients might receive private rooms and better furnishings, while the poor occupied crowded wards designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Diagnosis functioned as a spatial code. Certain wings became associated with melancholia, others with mania, and moving from one space to another changed a person's social identity within the institution. This internal geography mirrored broader social hierarchies, extending class and gender boundaries into daily life inside the asylum. Spatial separation made inequality a built feature of care, ensuring that architecture reinforced rather than challenged prevailing social orders. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Therapeutic spaces often doubled as organizational devices, with day rooms, workshops, and gardens arranged to serve both cure and control. Moral treatment promised occupation and fresh air as remedies for disturbed minds, so institutions built laundries, workshops, and gardens where supervised tasks could fill days and provide visible evidence of improvement. In practice, these activities structured movement and supplied the asylum with predictable labor, transforming therapy into a form of institutional productivity. Tasks were valuable because they could be counted and supervised, not always because they restored a person's sense of purpose. The layout of work spaces minimized unsupervised interaction and maximized observability, making activity legible to managers and inspectors. As a result, therapeutic rhetoric often masked economic and administrative aims, and patients found themselves confined within routines intended to manage the population as much as to heal individuals. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Design determined daily choreography, turning living into an architecture of schedules and sight lines. Dining halls were communal and open so meals could be served and consumed under observation, turning nutrition into a public ritual. Sleeping wards placed beds in orderly ranks that discouraged private movement and made nocturnal behavior visible and auditable. Visiting rooms were formal and supervised, preventing spontaneous embraces or prolonged conversation that might upset institutional order. Even ablutions and dressing occurred in spaces arranged to reduce concealment and to simplify oversight. The building taught inhabitants how to move, when to linger, and when to vanish from sight, shaping daily experience through the placement of thresholds and communal spaces. That choreography of visibility became habitual, internalized by both staff and residents and enforced by the immutable grammar of the built environment. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Materials and furnishings bore the same logic of control, favoring durability and containment over warmth and privacy. Heavy, bolted furniture reduced opportunities for sudden movement. Fixed fittings and robust fixtures made rooms semi-permanent and difficult to personalize. Floors, paints, and fabrics were chosen for ease of cleaning and resistance rather than for softness, making interiors functional and austere. Windows were sometimes small, barred, or recessed in ways that limited escape more than they offered views outward, framing the outside world as distant and unreachable. Even decorative choices worked to normalize the environment and minimize disorder, teaching occupants to accept a shared aesthetic of institutional propriety. These material decisions communicated priorities clearly: manage risk, prevent concealment, and endure wear. The physical palette of the asylum thus taught occupants how to inhabit a life designed less for comfort than for control. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Staff placement and circulation were coordinated with architectural sightlines to prioritize supervision over sustained therapeutic engagement. Nurses and attendants were stationed at points where they could view multiple wards and corridors, their posts designed to maximize visual coverage with minimal movement. Shift patterns and task lists emphasized rapid, efficient handling of duties so that interactions tended toward tasks rather than toward conversation. That logistics-driven practice shaped relationships. Staff were trained to maintain order and to manage bodies rather than to develop long-term psychological support. Training focused on routines and compliance, and the building's layout supported that focus by rewarding quick visibility and measurable outcomes. The architecture and staffing model thus reinforced one another, producing a regime where duty and surveillance overshadowed attentive, empathetic care. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Security features were embedded in everyday life under the guise of protection, making containment feel like care. Gates, ironwork, and locked doors promised safety for fragile minds and peace for communities, claims that made heavy restraints seem necessary and humane. Internal fences and segmented courtyards enabled staff to stage movement and to isolate groups without dramatic displays, smoothing management of the population. Locks and keyed systems reduced immediate risks of wandering or injury, but also removed autonomy and sealed patients away from spontaneous contact with families. The rhetoric of safety justified measures that curtailed choice, and the physical implements of security communicated permanence. Once in place, those features normalized limits on freedom and turned routine protection into structural isolation that shaped life and identity inside the institution. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Landscaping and outdoor spaces played a dual role as therapy and demonstration, offering magnetized views for visitors while remaining instruments of supervision. Gardens, promenades, and conservatories were arranged to provide calm scenes for inspection tours and to create predictable routes for patients during exercise periods. Paths and hedges guided movement and kept groups within sight lines, enabling staff to supervise outdoor activity without disrupting the impression of tranquility. These cultivated exteriors served publicity as much as therapy, providing donors with visual proof that fresh air and orderly recreation formed part of the cure. Enclosed lawns and planted borders functioned as controlled stages where moving bodies could be watched and counted, their motions interpreted as indicators of progress. Thus, even the pastoral components of asylum design served institutional priorities and reinforced patterns of visibility. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Records, ledgers, and plans worked with architecture to convert people into categories, mapping human lives onto rooms and wards. Administrators used ledgers and bed lists to balance occupancy and reputation, moving patients between spaces for reasons of numbers as often as needs. Floor plans encoded diagnostic categories so that transferring a person from one wing to another signaled a change in social status as well as in treatment. The physical layout supported this bureaucratic logic, making statistical management an architectural practice. When decisions were guided by counts and reputations rather than by individualized care, buildings acted as mechanisms for institutional order. That administrative geometry turned bodily movement into a managerial tool and reduced complex lives to entries in registers and footprints on plans. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Over time, the architecture of control left psychological marks that outlasted bricks and mortar, teaching people where to feel small and where to remain silent. Former residents later described how certain staircases, shutters, or corridors could reopen panic years after release, how the very geometry of a room could summon shame and fear. Spatial discipline became embodied, shaping memory and identity beyond the period of confinement itself. Yet those same structures could also point toward change when administrators and reformers chose differently. Attendants who softened routines, relatives who demanded reviews, and architects who proposed domestic-scale wards hinted that space could be rearranged to support dignity. Where investments were made in private rooms, better sightlines, and trained staff, the built environment helped conversation and recovery. This tension between architecture as instrument of power and as potential instrument of care would direct debates about asylum reform for generations to come. Control remained encoded in stone and seam, a reminder that design and power were inseparable in practice. Chapter 3: Daily Life Behind Locked Doors. At dawn, the asylum announced itself with the ring of a bell and the choreography that shaped every corridor. Light seeped through high windows, revealing rows of beds and faces that still belonged to other lives beyond the walls. The air carried the smells of starch and boiled porridge, of coal smoke and the faint medicinal tang of camphor and vinegar. Attendants moved in practice patterns, pulling back blankets, smoothing sheets, adjusting clothing, their motions efficient and impersonal. Beds were counted, bodies recorded, and the day began with a sense that order could hold back unruly minds. Patients rose into rituals they had not chosen and learned quickly how to align their hours with a schedule that left little room for private thought. In that first hour, the asylum turned waking into a public act, making morning a demonstration of compliance rather than an intimate return to consciousness. By the time breakfast arrived, the day had already been measured exactly. Bathing and dressing were public rituals shaped by institutional logic rather than privacy. Tubs and basins stood in common rooms where attendants supervised washing to ensure conformity and record reactions. Water temperature, flinches, steadiness of hands while dressing, all could be read as symptoms and noted in journals. Those who resisted display risked being framed as dangerous or not returning to normal. Clothing signaled status. Some received neatly pressed garments while others wore coarse institutional dress that erased former class distinctions. Personal items were scarce and tightly regulated, turning dressing into a reminder that identity had been repurposed for order. Patients learned to perform neatness and predictability to avoid attention, discovering that compliance could lessen coercion even if it cost authenticity. Attendants jotted small details into casebooks, and those notes guided later decisions about diet, work assignments, and movement through wards. And release prospects. Work filled the asylum day under the banner of moral treatment and the practical need to run the institution with minimal cost. Laundries, sewing rooms, kitchens, and gardens became spaces for supervised labor presented as therapy, places where task completion supposedly rebuilt character. Supervisors praised diligence and recorded productivity as signs of improvement, turning human activity into measurable output. Hands that once labored in factories or fields found new, regimented tasks that matched institutional timetables more than individual aptitude. Therapeutic language obscured the fact that patient labor subsidized the asylum's functioning, supplying clean linens, meals, and garden produce. Work was valuable to managers because it produced visible routines and prevented aimless wandering, reducing chances of disturbance. Patients who could not or would not fit assigned tasks risked suspicion and harsher measures, while those who excelled might gain small privileges or slightly better quarters. In this way, occupation served both care narratives and the practical bookkeeping of institutional life. An order, Silence hours were woven into the schedule as if quiet could cure the mind, a timed ritual that enforced absence of sound. Periods of enforced hush served administrative aims. Fewer disturbances meant easier supervision and cleaner records. For some patients, silence offered space to recover, but for many the pressure to be mute intensified inner turmoil and bred panic. Those who could not conform were sometimes isolated in padded cells or removed to locked side chambers, where sensory deprivation deepened confusion. Seclusion was framed in medical terms as protection from overstimulation, yet the practice often amounted to punishment or convenient containment. Staff rationalized these measures as temporary and therapeutic, but repeated isolation left lasting scars of disorientation and distrust. The institutional calendar turned vocal expression into a risk, making speech a behavior that could invite restraint rather than empathy. In that climate, voices grew quieter and private suffering swelled under the rule of imposed silence, and eroded trust between people. Meals served as public rituals that combined nutrition with assessment, a daily census watched closely by attendants. The dining hall was communal, long tables arranged so staff could observe who ate and who needed encouragement. Food was simple and meant to sustain many bodies rather than to please any individual palate. In private wards, fare might be better, but most inmates received stews, bread, and thin tea that reflected tight budgets. Eating in public removed the privacy of nourishment, making appetite a gauge for mental state and creating shame for those who struggled. Visitors were shown improved provisions as proof of benevolent care, while the general population accepted modest rations. Meals reinforced hierarchy and routine, and eating patterns joined the clockwork of daily life, measured and judged as part of treatment. Hunger, fullness, and disdain became visible markers in the asylum economy of care. Records noted portion sizes and refusals, and those who took extra food risked punishment or isolation. Medical rounds were brisk and often public, with physicians moving quickly from bed to bed, making short judgments that could alter a patient's daily life. Doctors relied on attendance notes and visible behavior because time rarely allowed extended interviews, so small gestures gained diagnostic importance. Casebooks compressed complex histories into dates, symptoms, and prescribed actions, and a single entry could justify seclusion or transfer. Attendants translated written orders into routine. They administered medicines, adjusted diets, and changed work assignments accordingly. Administrators used recorded outcomes to report to governors and to shape institutional policy, while families found it difficult to challenge written decisions. Casebook entries hardened into labels over time, shaping how attendants and doctors perceived each person and affecting release prospects and every subsequent encounter, making a single visit ripple across months and years of confinement. The weight of writing created institutional memory that was slow to change, so annotations followed people through successive administrations and framed responses for years. Night brought a different regimen, a tightening of rules that turned darkness into another form of containment. Attendants made frequent rounds to count bodies and to intervene if someone became restless or violent. Beds lay close together and thin partitions meant coughs, cries, and muttered words traveled quickly, making private distress communal. For some, the hush worsened hallucinations and fear, making bedtime a struggle against imagined threats, while others found quiet a brief relief. Night checks could be reassuring when gentle, but they were often abrupt and clinical, sometimes involving restraint or removal to side rooms. Sedatives were used to dull agitation but offered little true healing, creating groggy mornings and blurred cognition. Residents learned to anticipate checks, to hide small comforts under mattresses, and to survive a night where privacy and safety were fragile illusions. The night routine reinforced control over sleeping bodies. Visits were scheduled and supervised, turning family reunions into brief exchanges that rarely repaired months of separation. Visiting rooms were formal and monitored, conversations interrupted by attendants and physical contact constrained to preserve order. Letters served as lifelines but often passed through staff hands and could be censored when officials judged content inappropriate. Travel costs made regular visits impossible for many, so separations stretched into long absences without renewal. Poor families lacked means to challenge commitments, and relatives who tried faced legal and administrative barriers that made release difficult. Those with connections and resources secured more reviews, while the marginalized found their fates shaped by paperwork and distance. The asylum reshaped family life by converting bonds into occasional glimpses and turning everyday care into institutional management. The emotional toll was profound. Relatives saw change and sometimes believed the institution had helped. Others left angry, and silence remained. Attendants were the daily interface of the asylum, the ones who carried out orders, and who sometimes became the only regular human presence in a patient's life. Many attendants were untrained and poorly paid, learning skills by imitation and repetition rather than through formal instruction. The pressure of long shifts and the monotony of chores produced fatigue and sometimes rough handling, but it also produced familiarity and, on occasion, genuine affection. Small acts of kindness, an extra blanket, a word of encouragement, the smuggling of a letter, could alter a day and were remembered long after the record books forgot them. Conversely, moments of impatience or sanction left wounds that medicine could not heal, and abuses were sometimes rationalized as necessary for order. The relationship between patient and attendant therefore oscillated between compassion and coercion, mediated by institutional constraints and individual temperaments. These daily interactions shaped how residents understood care and influenced recoveries, releases, and the maintenance of dignity in tangible ways. Children placed in asylums experienced institutional life differently because most facilities were designed around adult routines and labor demands. Youth were expected to conform to adult schedules, to take on chores, and to adapt quickly to regimens that left little room for play or schooling. The moral treatment promised structured occupation and attention, but often failed to translate into developmentally appropriate care for young bodies and minds. Growing up within walls altered identity formation. Children learned to prioritize obedience and measured behavior over spontaneity and exploration. Some were separated from siblings and family contact dwindled, producing lasting emotional scars and a skewed sense of normalcy. When children remained into adolescence, their sense of personhood could be shaped entirely by institutional life, creating adults who knew only the rhythms of wards and workshops. This generational continuity turned asylums into places where childhood could be shortened and where futures were often prefigured by institutional needs rather than personal growth. And narrowed horizons. The principle of moral treatment promised dignity, occupation, and individualized attention, but ideals often faltered when asylums faced overcrowding and scarce resources. Disease outbreaks forced quarantine and reduced contact, while understaffing made routines a substitute for therapy. Financial strain meant fewer attendants, poorer food, and limited opportunities for meaningful work, shifting emphasis from cure to maintenance. When tensions rose, institutions favored containment, seclusion, sedation, and restraints that prioritized order over conversation. Rare riots and attempts at escape hardened policies and were cited to justify harsher measures. Inspectors and reformers demanded improvements, yet changes were uneven, constrained by budgets and governance. This gap between theory and practice revealed how fragile the promise of humane care could be, leaving many patients to bear the consequences. Over time, such failures produced public inquiries and scandalous reports that forced some reforms, but progress arrived after suffering. Identity eroded under routine, as names became diagnoses and personal histories were shortened into casebook entries and bed numbers. Official language turned complex sorrow into categories easier to manage than to understand. Yet small acts of self persisted. A hidden keepsake, a whispered memory during laundry, a song hummed on a walk. These gestures were quiet assertions of personhood that resisted reduction to symptoms. Patients traded stories in hushed corners, learning which corridors offered privacy and which thresholds invited scrutiny. Some attendants leaned toward kindness, noting birthdays, smuggling notes, and lobbying for gentler treatment. Relatives who insisted on reviews sometimes brought people home, but many remained lost to paperwork and distance. Those tiny resistances preserved threads of self inside institutions designed to sever them, offering the hope that memory could outlast confinement. Explore those therapies in the next chapter soon. Chapter 4: The Cruel Cures. The asylum promised cure and demanded action from visible remedies that families could see and doctors could record. It offered ritual where uncertainty reigned, methods that made intervention legible to people who feared silence. Physicians arrived with surgical certainty, bringing into wards the procedures and confidence of hospital practice. Overcrowding and administrative pressure narrowed choices toward dramatic practices that produced measurable signs. Administration valued treatments that could be logged and shown to governors and donors as proof of progress. What began as moral guidance shifted into a catalog of interventions that were physical, painful, and public. Patients found their days measured by procedures rather than conversation, and the promise of care often meant enduring tests that extracted endurance more than consent. The expansion of medical authority inside institutions blurred lines between cure and control and prepared minds to accept harsher methods. These interventions would be justified as therapeutic even when they left bodies weakened and spirits diminished for years afterward. Cold water therapies became a mainstay because they appeared decisive and physiological, an apparently scientific force against unruly nerves. Patients were plunged into ice baths, wrapped in wet sheets, or sprayed with frigid water under the claim that shock would calm agitation. Attendants timed exposures, recorded reactions, and judged success by the rapidity with which a body stilled. To those forced into icy pools, the experience was terror, a sensation that stripped away dignity and produced physical shock. Some recovered calm after treatment, but others suffered prolonged trembling, circulation problems, and recurring panic tied to memories of that plunge. Hydrotherapy's public nature meant it functioned as both treatment and demonstration, offering donors visible proof of intervention. The ritual of immersion masked the personal cost inflicted on fragile bodies, and the blunt physiology of shock became a substitute for conversation and care. Cold therapy thus exemplified how the search for quick, measurable results often trumped slower approaches grounded in gentler observation. Purgatives and emetics revived older medical doctrines that equated mental disturbance with bodily imbalance, and doctors sought to purify the body. Strong laxatives and vomiting agents emptied patients of fluids and left them weakened, the body made raw in the name of balance. Attendants recorded frequency of evacuation and timing of onset to mark progress, turning private sickness into institutional data. The repeated cycle of purging drained strength and created dependence on repeated interventions that could mask worsening condition. Dehydration, electrolyte loss, and exhaustion followed intensive regimens, and fragile patients sometimes failed to recover their previous vigor. Those who administered treatment believed in corrective discharge, but many who endured it experienced humiliation, social stigma, and long-term bodily harm. Purgation illustrated the gulf between theory and outcome, and it became a common example of how physical intervention could substitute for attentive conversation or individualized care without remedy. Blistering and cauterization returned treatment to the realm of visible wounds, instruments marking bodies with the evidence of intervention. Physicians applied irritant poultices, blistering agents, and sometimes heated tools to skin believed connected to nervous disorder. The resulting sores and scars were tangible signs that medicine had acted, a form of remedy meant to release internal disturbance outward through pain. For patients, the experience was raw and shameful. Skin raw with burns and dressings that smelled of old liniments and hospital steam. These measures often left the nervous system in a worse state than before, with chronic pain and damaged tissues replacing original complaints. Blistering made suffering legible to inspectors, but it also normalized inflicting pain under the banner of cure, a justification with long-term consequences. The moral rhetoric of treatment thus took physical form, and those visible wounds later shaped how survivors remembered their time inside. Blistering showed how visible interventions were confused with cure and lasting harm. Mechanical contraptions promised modern solutions, devices that could be measured and standardized across wards. Among them were machines that spun or rotated, contrivances meant to alter perception and induce exhaustion as a path to calmer thought. Patients strapped into moving seats endured nausea and vertigo that sometimes produced temporary quiet by sheer fatigue. Inventors praised mechanization as rational therapy, and administrators favored tools that reduced the need for constant supervision. The brief sedation that followed could mask underlying confusion and extend sensory disturbance beyond the session. Mechanized therapy reflected confidence in industrial fixes for human frailty and revealed how enthusiasm for machines often eclipsed attention to individual suffering. Such devices served as spectacles for visitors, reassuring donors while imposing bodily strain on those least able to endure it. The aftermath included lingering dizziness, humiliation, and the erosion of self-identity. Restraints became routine when bodies refused the silence the asylum demanded, tools framed as protection yet experienced as punishment. Straitjackets bound arms and prevented strikes. Chains secured limbs when attendants feared flight or violence. Administrators defended restraints as safety measures that protected patients, staff, and community, and documented them in reports. For those bound, the loss of control was humiliating and dehumanizing. Dependence on others for simple tasks intensified shame. Prolonged immobilization produced chafing, pressure wounds, and circulation problems, despite crude rotations of bindings by attendants. The visible image of restraint also functioned as evidence. A strapped body became a public sign of dangerousness and thus justified more confinement. Restraint solved managerial anxiety while reinforcing stigma, converting resistance into a medical label that reduced chances of release. Families and visitors rarely saw full extent of immobilization, and the narrative of safety often obscured long-term harm. Chemical calming grew as practitioners sought less visible ways to manage distress, and tonics and opiates filled that role. Laudanum reduced agitation and induced sleep, producing pharmacological quiet that eased supervision and avoided physical confrontation. Doctors favored remedies that could be dosed and recorded, fitting bureaucratic models of care. The quiet often came at cost. Dependence, cognitive dulling, and social withdrawal replaced original symptoms. Medicated patients sometimes lost capacity to engage in work or conversation that might aid recovery, and addiction complicated release. Medication served as a social tool that smoothed assimilation of disruptive bodies into institutional routines. Chemical control blurred treatment and containment, therapeutic in theory but compensatory in practice, masking understaffing and resource shortages. Families often accepted medicated calm as proof of improvement, unaware that the tranquil surface concealed dependency, cognitive loss, and reduced chances of reintegration over many years. An era of scientific zeal introduced experimental procedures into the asylum, and ethical safeguards were weak or inconsistent. Patients became subjects for novel devices, experimental drafts, and invasive examinations that were justified as necessary research. New instruments were trialed on ward populations, and curious surgeons explored boundaries with limited regard for long-term harm. Such practices reflected confidence in progress and a willingness to accept risk when outcomes were uncertain, especially for those labeled hopeless. Consent was informal or coerced. Administrative approval sufficed, and patients' capacity to refuse was often disregarded or ignored. Families and guardians rarely had full information, and the balance of power favored medical authority and institutional expediency. The experimental culture produced both genuine advances and grave mistakes, but for many the stakes were personal and catastrophic. Regulatory reforms followed slowly over decades. Seclusion and sensory deprivation were used to reduce stimulation and to create conditions thought conducive to introspection and calm. Small padded rooms and locked side chambers isolated people from social contact and limited sensory input to near silence. In theory, the removal of noise and distraction might allow anguished minds to settle, but for many the deprivation intensified hallucinations and panic. Time in isolation could stretch for days or weeks, and temporal disorientation often followed, making it difficult for inmates to rejoin ordinary conversation. Sensory removal could break sleep patterns, heighten fear, and produce a fragile equilibrium that collapsed under slightest provocation. Attendants viewed seclusion as a controllable intervention, but patients described the experience as dislocating and prolonged loneliness. The practice reflected a medical belief that external chaos mirrored inner turmoil, so reducing the former would recalibrate the latter, a logic that failed in many cases. Seclusion thus revealed how containment disguised itself as therapy and often deepened disorders regularly. Consent in asylum practice was fragile, often assumed by administrators and rarely robustly recorded. Commitment could be an administrative act begun by magistrates or relatives with limited clinical oversight, and appeals were slow and rare. Patients lacked reliable advocates, and protests were often read as symptoms rather than legitimate objections. Medical authority and institutional momentum allowed coercive interventions to proceed with little scrutiny, normalizing practices later questioned. Families deferred to doctors and valued order, and courts frequently favored institutions' accounts over detailed inquiries. This structural imbalance let controversial procedures persist and left detainees with paperwork and distance standing between them and legal remedy. Over time, reformers and some physicians recorded harms and pushed for oversight, but change was incremental, limited by budgets, local politics, and the inertia of established practice. Many suffered while waiting for reforms to gradually arrive. The long-term effects of harsh interventions were often physical and psychological, woven into lasting impairment. Cold shocks could lead to chronic circulation problems and lifelong sensitivity to cold. Repeated purging weakened bodies and digestive systems, blistering left scars and nerve damage. Sedatives and narcotics dulled cognition, creating a fog that interfered with memory and motivation long after prescriptions ended. Psychological consequences included humiliation, loss of agency, and chronic distrust of medical authority, memories that resurfaced in nightmares and panic. Many former patients struggled to reclaim identities, finding families changed and communities reluctant to accept those labeled mad. Loss of work skills, disrupted social ties, and lingering health problems produced poverty and social exclusion for survivors. The trauma of such procedures could replicate intergenerationally as families bore stigma and children inherited altered expectations about distress and care. Public inquiries later recorded patterns of harm and neglect. Resistance to cruel practices came from attendants, relatives, journalists, and reforming physicians who documented harm and spoke out. Whistleblowers risked careers to reveal abuses, and reports stirred public outrage that made secrecy harder to maintain. Parliamentary inquiries and professional debate produced recommendations to limit worst practices, improve inspections, and strengthen record-keeping. Some institutions adopted less brutal methods, investing in staff training, occupational tasks, and spaces that encouraged conversation and dignity. Reforms remained uneven, constrained by budgets, local politics, and administrators wedded to routine. Victorian treatment left traces in law, architecture, and medical culture that took decades to change, and some harmful logics endured into later eras. This history warns of the dangers of favoring visible action over careful listening and informed consent, a lesson that underpins modern mental health ethics. Public memory keeps victims' names and warnings alive. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Inmates. The asylum swallowed stories the way the city swallowed names. People arrived carrying whole lives, photographs, letters, trades, recipes, jokes, and grudges, and attendants recorded their arrival with the same mechanical calm with which they later noted diet, work, and incidents. Casebooks compressed biography into shorthand, and narrative detail thinned under institutional habit. A farmer's laughter became a line on a page. A mother's hymn slipped under a heading of melancholia. Social roles unraveled inside wards that preferred tidy labels to messy histories. Over time, personal nuance resigned itself to administration. The more the building demanded order, the less room there remained for memory and matter that did not fit a diagnosis. Belongings lost their private weight when redistributed for institutional use, and letters that once tethered people to home grew thin with delay and censorship. The physical traces of a life could vanish in a week as easily as a name could fade from a register, and months later relatives might struggle to recall how someone had smiled. Women often bore the brunt of institutional power in ways that revealed Victorian anxieties about gender and control. A wife who refused a husband's authority, a young mother whose grief refused neat timing, a woman who spoke defiantly. All risked being labeled unstable and committed under the auspices of care. Medical language read feminine sorrow as hysteria or moral failing, and legal mechanisms made commitment a private remedy for public discomfort. Once inside, women experienced stricter surveillance, tighter moral expectations, and sometimes harsher restrictions than men in parallel wards. Domestic knowledge, the tasks that had defined identity, were repurposed into institutional labor that erased previous competence. Husbands, fathers, or guardians could initiate processes that removed women from family life with little oversight, and appeals required resources many families did not possess. The asylum thus functioned as an instrument of patriarchal order as much as a medical institution, reshaping households by excising the inconvenient, the noisy, and the non-conforming under thinly medicalized language. Poverty itself was criminalized through commitment, turning social failure into psychiatric diagnosis in practical terms, if not in law. Men and women who could not pay rents, who scavenged for work, or who slept irregular hours were vulnerable to being described as vagrant or unstable. Parishes and local officials sometimes found institutionalization cheaper than prolonged relief or chaotic lodging. Commitments removed visible distress from markets and streets, simplifying civic management at the cost of family bonds and autonomy. Those sent to asylums for reasons of expense rarely returned with wages or property to resume old lives. They returned, if at all, with diminished prospects and weakened social ties. The poor faced barriers to legal recourse and lacked advocates to press for review, making release contingent on charity or chance rather than on rigorous reassessment. Through these processes, class lines hardened and institutions absorbed those the city could less easily house, producing an economy where care and containment blurred into administrative convenience. Children inside asylums were among the most tragic evidence of systemic failure, their lives folded into adult routines and labor patterns that stunted development. Some arrived because a mother's illness made daily care impossible, others because poverty or legal disruption had severed support networks, and a few because courts and guardians deemed institutions better than chaos. Yet most asylums were designed for adult bodies and adult schedules, not for play, schooling, or the tender work of socialization. Children learned to take on chores and to compress emotion into silence as part of survival. Education, when it existed, was sporadic and pragmatic, teaching tasks that served the institution more than a future life beyond it. Growing up within walls shaped identity in narrow ways. Obedience over curiosity, routine over exploration, early competence in labor roles at the expense of broader learning. Those who remained into adolescence often emerged with habits suited to wards and workshops rather than to ordinary family life, making reintegration hazardous and futures precarious. Legal recourse for the confined offered hope on paper but proved inconsistent and often inaccessible in practice. Commitment processes involved doctors, magistrates, or family petitions, and appeals required time, funds, and legal literacy that many relatives lacked. Reviews could be perfunctory, and errant entries in casebooks hardened into long-term labels. When families challenged commitments, they faced bureaucratic inertia and institutional narratives that favored stability over disruption. Geographic distance compounded the problem. Visiting was costly and slow, and separated kin found it difficult to mobilize support. Where wealth and social capital existed, release and review were more likely. Where poverty or scandal prevailed, confinement could become indefinite. The legal architecture favored institutions that needed predictability and budgetary certainty, so courts often deferred to administrators whose records presented neat accounts of progress or danger. In effect, the law sometimes reinforced institutional permanence rather than checking it. Names faded in ledgers as photographs yellowed in pockets and letters gathered dust in cupboards. The asylum's paperwork reduced complex human histories into rows of symptoms, treatment dates, and coded notes, and those clinical fingerprints often replaced remembered selves in subsequent interactions. Possessions redistributed for institutional needs erased physical anchors to identity. Ornaments, tools, and clothing were repurposed and scattered. Memory survived in fragments. A melody hummed in a laundry room, a recipe passed in whispers, the distinct phrasing of a family anecdote shared in rare visits. Those fragments became crucial for relatives and later historians attempting to reassemble lost biographies. In many cases, the shredded edges of a life remained. A baptismal entry, a school record, a scrap of correspondence. Reconstructing the whole required stubborn attention to small signs. The loss of names and the flattening of biography had consequences beyond nostalgia. They shaped how descendants understood lineage, rights, and belonging in ways that lasted generations. Some institutions became long-term residences rather than places of treatment, moving from hospitals toward custodial homes for those seen as chronically difficult to manage. Overcrowding, fiscal logic, and the challenge of reintegration pushed administrators toward retention. Patients who aged within these walls accumulated medical needs, frailty, and dependency that made discharge a risky choice for relatives and communities. The institution, greeted as a temporary refuge at first, calcified into a permanent world with its own norms, routines, and economies. Those who lived and died in asylums left burial records that sometimes outlived their personal stories, while families adapted by creating new domestic realities in their absence. The permanence of institutional life fractured expectations about care in later years, altering how communities planned for aging, incapacity, and social support. In effect, asylums became refuges for the unwanted and repositories for the socially costly, a function that governments and municipalities found both useful and morally troubling in different measures. Private lives were rewritten by institutional regulation in ways that removed agency and dignity from the confined, interrupting marriages, parenting roles, and work identities. The capacity to make decisions was curtailed by paperwork and the logic of containment. Marriages drifted or were effectively ended in practice as partners adapted to new circumstances, and children were often raised by extended kin or sent into other institutions. Economic roles vanished as skills rusted from disuse, and the social capital that once underpinned livelihoods evaporated. Re-entry into community life became difficult, not only because of stigma but because the rhythms of ward life did not easily translate to the demands of external labor markets. Families sometimes reinvented narratives of absence to protect reputation, while others quietly mourned without public rights. The institutional reshaping of personal life had ripple effects on local economies, social expectations, and the distribution of care across households that lasted long after doors closed. Stigma clung to former patients like a second skin, shaping employment prospects, marriage choices, and neighborhood acceptance. Employers and neighbors recognized marks of past institutionalization and often acted on that knowledge, narrowing opportunities and dampening trust. Descendants absorbed stories of shame and silence, leading some families to hide histories and others to turn memory into cautionary tales that guided behavior. The fear of relapse sometimes became self-fulfilling. Social isolation, lack of work, and limited support reproduced the conditions that had contributed to earlier breakdowns. Community reintegration required allies, employment, and visible health. Without those elements, many survivors drifted into poverty and marginalization. Social attitudes hardened across generations, affecting how societies treated mental distress and who they considered deserving of care. The legacy of stigma thus reproduced exclusion even when institutions reformed practices. Records and archives preserve parts of this history but are themselves partial and fragile, offering both help and sorrow to those who search. Admission books, case notes, and burial registers provide leads, yet they are marred by illegibility, loss, and administrative bias. Fires, purges, and simple neglect destroyed many files, while surviving documents often reflect institutions' priorities rather than patients' voices. Oral histories and family recollections fill some gaps but are shaped by memory and shame. Piecing together biographies requires patient cross-referencing. Parish records, local newspapers, school logs, and stray letters become puzzle pieces. Where artifacts survive, a smudged photograph, a penned recipe, a pension record, they become small triumphs over institutional erasure. Archivists and activists who reclaim names perform acts of justice, restoring personhood by excavating paper trails and unquieting silence where possible. Resistance and reclamation took many forms, from relatives demanding reviews to activists documenting abuses and pressing for legislative change. Small acts sustained memory. Preserving a letter, insisting on burial rights, keeping a photograph in a pocket for decades. Local campaigns sometimes secured releases or improved conditions for particular wards, and reformers used individual case studies to reveal systemic patterns. Burial societies and parish clerks occasionally provided crucial evidence for family claims, and persistent petitions could force magistrates to revisit commitments. Over time, legal reforms introduced more safeguards, periodic reviews, and stricter criteria for detention. Yet change was slow and uneven, requiring sustained attention and public conscience. The work of remembering and recovering names became a moral project that insisted institutions answer for the lives once entrusted to them. The human cost of forgetting was not merely practical but spiritual, severing rites of passage, funerary observances, and the shared stories that bind communities. Without public commemoration, grief became private and awkward, and families adapted narratives to preserve dignity or to avoid gossip. Loss of material culture was matched by erosion of kinship networks that sustained belonging. Where memory survived, it often did so in quiet rituals. A song hummed at a gathering, a yearly visit to a grave, an old plate kept in the pantry. Those small acts mattered because they stitched continuity across ruptures. Remembering an ancestor who survived institutionalization became an act of defiance and love, undoing some of the work of erasure. Over generations, recovered names and stories restored lineage and created obligations to care differently, shaping how communities and institutions reckoned with the past and vowed not to repeat it. Chapter 6: The Asylum Scandals. Scandal in Victorian asylums rarely appeared as a single explosive moment. It began as a pattern, a string of small failings that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored. An attendant might whisper of a bruise left unaccounted for. A discharged person might tell a consistent story of neglect, or a clergyman might complain about a parishioner vanished into institutional care. These fragments met institutional instincts to protect reputation and finances. Governors polished facades and choreographed inspections so visitors saw manicured gardens and quiet wards while problem wings stayed locked. The steam of scandal rose only when outsiders gathered evidence, when journalists, reformers, or relatives linked episodes into a coherent narrative. Public fury followed slowly and then quickly, forcing municipal and national authorities to reckon with systems that treated containment as management rather than care. The resulting inquiries and headlines reshaped how communities thought about responsibility and allowed victims' voices to move from whisper to record. Reports from inspections painted grim pictures that contradicted public claims of benevolence, and the contrast fueled alarm. Inspectors found cockroaches in kitchens, damp bedding, and wards thick with unwashed linens. Disease spread quickly through crowded rooms and vulnerable bodies, while managers blamed seasonal shortages or itinerant staff for problems they knew were structural. Annual reports emphasized expenditure on buildings and committees while quietly reflecting cuts to wages and fewer attendants per ward. The arithmetic of cost framed many decisions. Cheaper labor, extended rations, delayed repairs. Where donors sought visible prestige, they funded stonework rather than salaries, producing institutions that glittered for visitors but frayed internally. Photographs taken for publicity concealed the true state of life, where staff were overworked and patients went long days without meaningful contact. These revelations stunned local communities who had invested in the idea of humane care and demanded immediate answers about oversight and priorities. Abuse emerged in multiple forms, not only neglect but also instances of direct physical violence and sexual misconduct that administrations often tried to hide. Attendants frustrated by long hours sometimes lashed out, and hierarchical systems made complaint hazardous for lower status staff. Women in wards were especially vulnerable to exploitation because they lived under stricter moral surveillance and because privacy was rare. When allegations of sexual predation surfaced, institutions tended to protect their names by dismissing complainants as unreliable or morally suspect. Physical punishment appeared in the record as enforced labor or corrective discipline, and the language of treatment provided plausible cover for coercion. Even when families noticed injuries, they were told accidents happen or that the patient's condition made them prone to falls. The structural power imbalance between governors and patients, between patrons and attendants, meant that accusations could be smothered by administrative mechanisms and social pressures that prioritized institutional survival. Some of the most damning scandals involved deliberate falsification of records and active cover-ups by managers who feared loss of funding and status. Governors sometimes altered admission dates, omitted incidents from annual returns, or prepared staged visits to escort inspectors through the best wards. In other cases, boards reassigned difficult patients to peripheral buildings or to criminal asylums where oversight was weaker. When lawsuits threatened reputation, institutions negotiated quiet settlements or employed legal delays that drained claimants' resources. The routine of paperwork became a weapon. Edited casebooks, amended ledgers, and carefully shaped minutes rewrote the past to protect the present. That manipulation of the documentary record meant that truth required digging through parish logs, private letters, and the memories of discharged patients. Exposures often hinged on someone willing to risk job and standing to speak, and when that gamble paid off, the public pressure forced inquiries that could not be easily contained. The press played a decisive role in turning hidden abuses into public crises, using pamphlets, newspapers, and serialized accounts to reach broad audiences. Investigative reporting collected testimonies, smuggled stories from former patients, and published descriptions that captured the public imagination. Sensational pieces could border on exploitation, yet many journalists pursued improvements with rigor, following leads into county records and courtroom files. Editorials framed scandals as moral failures requiring state intervention, while pamphleteers used individual cases to argue for legislative change. Rival papers amplified scandals to sell copies, but also spread awareness that pressured politicians and governors. As coverage intensified, parliamentary committees could be compelled to act, sending inspectors armed with subpoenas rather than polite invitations. The press thus served as a public microscope, focusing attention on institutions that had long depended on being out of sight and out of mind. Whistleblowers paid heavy costs for their courage, often losing jobs, facing legal threats, and suffering social ostracism despite having shown light on abuse. An attendant who reported cruelty risked dismissal and blacklisting in an employment market that valued obedience. A surgeon who protested harmful treatments might find his professional prospects curtailed. Relatives who demanded investigations sometimes faced accusations of scandal-mongering or of exploiting loved ones to attack charitable institutions. Even when protections existed in law, practical barriers, distance, expense, social pressure, kept many true accounts suppressed. Yet these speakers were also catalysts. Their testimonies often became the basis for reform, compelling officials to institute reviews, change staffing patterns, or prosecute egregious offenders. The rhythm of scandal depended as much on those who risked reprisals as on public appetite for change, and without such witnesses much abuse would have remained invisible. Parliamentary and legal inquiries became the mechanisms through which systemic problems were publicly documented and sometimes redressed. Committees summoned superintendents and attendants, required production of ledgers and casebooks, and published reports whose blunt language shocked civic pride. Courts occasionally overturned wrongful detentions, awarded damages, or compelled administrative reforms. But legal processes were slow and uneven, hampered by fragmented evidence, timid witnesses, and local officials protective of institutions. Some inquiries produced robust recommendations for inspection regimes, appointment of visiting committees, and more rigorous criteria for commitment. Others ended in compromises that tinkered around edges without addressing the deeper political and economic incentives that sustained neglect. Still, legal scrutiny established precedents and norms for subsequent oversight and helped shift public expectations toward transparency and accountability. Public tours of asylums shocked sensibilities and revealed the unsettling intersection of charity, entertainment, and social distance. Wealthy visitors paid for guided visits where they walked manicured paths and peered through verandas into arranged scenes meant to illustrate care. In other cases, paid spectators watched exhibitions of interesting cases, with patients displayed as curiosities behind glass or on raised benches. These spectacles reassured donors that their money produced visible results, while training the public to view mental distress as a spectacle rather than a social responsibility. For families, the tours were bittersweet. They affirmed that institutions had prestige while also underscoring separation from the daily reality their kin endured. The commodification of observation familiarized audiences with the idea that visibility equaled improvement, even when the wards shown were only carefully staged corners of a much harsher reality. Not all scandals led to transformation. Some resulted only in cosmetic fixes, rebranding, or the relocation of problems rather than genuine reform. Institutions that closed after exposure sometimes saw their functions transferred elsewhere or reconstituted under new governance, leaving underlying logics of containment intact. Administrators learned to adapt, anticipating scrutiny and hiding practices behind new bureaucratic forms. Reforms that prioritized appearances, fresh paint, new intake procedures, polished reports, could satisfy inspectors without changing day-to-day regimes that governed patient life. In many places, genuine improvement required sustained public attention, stronger legal safeguards, and consistent funding for staff training. The uneven nature of reform meant that while some institutions evolved toward more humane models, others preserved patterns of neglect under altered names. Survivors and families became vital witnesses and memory keepers after scandals faded from headlines, preserving records and pushing for accountability long after official attention drifted. Former patients who could speak or write produced harrowing accounts that contested sanitized institutional narratives and gave face to statistics. Families saved letters, receipts, and casebook extracts, using them as evidence in petitions and in campaigns for compensation or reform. Local historians, activists, and clerks sometimes rescued archives from destruction and created memorial lists that restored names erased by administrative practice. These acts of remembrance held institutions responsible in new ways, reframing scandal as a moral obligation to learn and to repair. The persistence of these voices ensured that scandals left traces in law, archives, and local memory rather than disappearing entirely into administrative silence. The lasting impact of asylum scandals reshaped debates about mental health care, civil liberties, and state responsibility for vulnerable people. Public revulsion over exposed abuses helped drive reforms that introduced regular inspections, clearer criteria for detention, and improved staffing standards. Professional ethics in medicine incorporated lessons about consent, oversight, and the limits of coercion. Yet the economic and political logics that had nurtured institutional cruelty did not vanish overnight. Debates about funding, local versus national responsibility, and the balance between protection and liberty continued to shape policies. The scandals left a brittle legacy. Reform advanced in fits and starts, guided by both the memory of past harms and persistent tensions about how best to care for those deemed unable to care for themselves. Collective memory of these scandals functions as a cautionary tale for modern systems of care, reminding society that transparency and accountability require maintenance rather than occasional attention. The stories of abuse and cover-up offer a human counterweight to abstract policy debates, making clear that paperwork and architecture cannot substitute for dignity, oversight, and the power of witness. Survivors' testimonies and family archives form moral compasses that point toward alternatives. Community support, legal protections, and resilient social networks that reduce the impulse to confine. The scandals of the past invite reflection on present institutions and challenge complacency, insisting that care must be measured not only by bricks and ledgers, but by respect, rights, and the persistent presence of those willing to speak out on behalf of the vulnerable. Chapter 7: The Last Chilling Secret. By the late 19th century, the asylum had settled into a durable role that outlived the zeal of reformers and the hopes of early philanthropists. What began in some places as an experiment in compassionate order had become a solution to problems that society preferred not to see in its streets and markets. Municipal budgets, local politics, and private donors intertwined to create an economy suited to containment. Asylums received steady payments for beds, and local authorities found that transferring an urban problem into institutional walls simplified governance. The cost of care rolled into public accounts, and the accounting favored predictability. Governments and boards calculated expenses as if people were units of maintenance rather than human beings with rights. That arithmetic created perverse incentives. Keep beds filled, manage labor, secure donor prestige, and minimize disruptive publicity. Over decades, those incentives ossified into policy. What remained hidden beneath language about care was a quiet calculus that treated human vulnerability as something to be warehoused, a practice both practical and morally troubling. Economic interests flourished around institutional life in ways that ensured the system's longevity. Suppliers sold bedding, medicines, and food to asylums at scale, creating predictable markets that industrial entrepreneurs learned to rely upon. Architects and builders benefited from repeated expansions and memorial wings endowed in the names of patrons. Legal firms and clerks thrived on the paperwork of commitment and guardianship. Even local tradespeople who supplied coal and meat gained from the reliable demand that asylum accounts guaranteed. The institutional ecosystem became embedded in local economies, and closing an asylum meant disrupting livelihoods beyond the gates. Employees formed communities that were tied, in practical terms, to the continuation of the institution. Administrators protected budgets in part because so many families relied on the wages paid within. Thus, the survival of asylums served social and economic networks that reached beyond the immediate moral arguments about care, producing vested interests that resisted rapid transformation. Political expediency smoothed over uncomfortable facts about overcrowding and mistreatment. Local magistrates and councils preferred solutions that removed visible disorder from civic spaces and reduced electoral conflict. Placing problematic individuals inside institutions was framed as public protection rather than personal punishment, a narrative that allowed officials to claim benevolence while avoiding deeper social reforms. Politicians found it easier to allocate funds for buildings and committees than to fund community services that would address homelessness, poverty, and chronic illness. During elections, the image of order mattered more than the messy work of rehabilitation, and politicians used that image to reassure constituents. As long as asylums served as symbols of control and civility, political actors had incentives to maintain them. Policy, therefore, favored containment as a practical compromise, and moral contradictions were softened by bureaucratic routines that normalized the status quo. Charitable prestige and the desire for civic recognition fed the system in subtler ways. Wealthy donors sponsored wings, gardens, and reading rooms, and their names on facades signaled civic virtue. That public recognition created a moral economy in which philanthropy served social standing as much as it did relief. Donors expected to see visible signs of improvement, and institutions staged gardens and promenades to satisfy those expectations. The need to show progress incentivized practices that produced legible results, measurable weight gains, catalog tasks completed, and beds filled with tractable residents, rather than slow, intimate work of therapy. Charity became entangled with status, and prestige could obscure the necessity for reform. The social capital of donation therefore helped stabilize institutional models, because shutting or radically altering a named wing implied a public admission of failure that patrons often preferred to avoid. The medical profession also found its power advanced through institutional authority, and professional ambitions shaped the endurance of asylums. Psychiatry as a field gained status by demonstrating control over difficult cases, and institutions became laboratories for new theories and techniques. Control of patient populations gave medical men material to write case studies and to publish professional reputations. Influence over policy, appointments, and training emerged from this nexus of clinical access and administrative power. Asylum medical directors often held sway in local governance and professional societies, creating networks that favored institutional continuity. The authority of physicians and surgeons was reinforced by the existence of custodial spaces where their decisions went largely unquestioned. Professional reward structures thus helped keep the system intact, because institutional practice offered the means to advance careers and to consolidate disciplinary influence. Legal frameworks provided a veneer of legitimacy even as they facilitated long-term detention. Statutes and commitment procedures codified processes that made transfer to an asylum administratively straightforward and legally defensible. Courts deferred to medical testimony and to institutional records in ways that often prioritized stability over reevaluation. The law equated institutionalization with care and practice, and appeals were costly, sluggish, and complex for families without resources. Guardianship arrangements and the language of incapacity allowed administrators to justify restraint and retention. Legal reforms that eventually introduced more safeguards did so slowly and unevenly, leaving a century in which administrative momentum outpaced protections. Law thereby functioned both as protector and as enabler, granting rights on paper while enabling extended confinement in bureaucratic reality. The final reveal of what truly sustained these institutions is less dramatic than a single hidden conspiracy and more chilling because it involves the ordinary workings of power, money, and indifference. What kept asylums alive was not merely architectural momentum or medical zeal, but a diffuse alliance of economic benefit, political convenience, social prestige, and juridical authority. Each element alone might not have endured, but together they created a system that fed on neglect and benefited from it. The asylum survived because many found it useful in different, overlapping ways. A place to hide social problems, a market for goods and services, a stage for philanthropy, an arena for professional advancement, and a legal container for difference. The moral horror lies in how collective systems of value, not necessarily malicious individuals, made endurance possible and even rational. That distributed culpability made reform slow and piecemeal, because dismantling the institution required confronting multiple constituencies simultaneously. This complex sustaining mechanism had human consequences that outlived institutional walls. People detained for years or decades lost skills, relationships, and the ability to reintegrate into communities that had moved on. Families adapted to absence, rewrote narratives to preserve social standing, or simply faded into practical separation. Children raised inside institutions learned patterns of dependence and compliance rather than autonomy, perpetuating cycles that touched subsequent generations. Survivors carried the scars of both treatments and social abandonment, and their marginalization fed into public accounts that justified continued containment. The social cost of the asylum economy showed up in neighborhoods where returned inmates struggled to find work or accommodations, reinforcing the argument that containment had been easier than responsibility. That legacy shaped how communities understood mental distress and who deserved public sympathy or state support. As reforms slowly arrived, they faced the inertia of embedded interests. Closing an asylum or radically changing its mission meant redistributing jobs, redirecting supply chains, and exposing political choices that could be unpopular. Managers resisted change because they feared chaos and loss of funding. Local economies feared unemployment, Donors feared reputational risk. Politicians feared electoral backlash. Reform, therefore, required not only moral clarity but careful negotiation of economic and political costs. Some institutions transformed into hospitals focused on therapy and rehabilitation, while others shuttered and left ghostly complexes where memories hardened into ruin. Successful change depended on creating alternative support structures, community care, housing, and employment programs that absorbed those released and reduced incentives to contain socially costly lives in a single place. The emotional weight of victims' lost voices is the moral core of this history, an ache that moves beyond policy and architecture into the lives of people who vanished from family narratives. The names erased from daily conversation returned in small, stubborn acts of remembrance. A preserved letter, a grave tended by distant kin, a recipe passed down despite absence. Those fragments became moral claims upon the present, insisting that memory matters and that institutions must answer for the human cost of containment. The stories of survivors remind us that policies have faces and that bureaucratic decisions translate into private tragedies. Reclaimed names and documented harms force communities to confront what they implicitly allowed, creating a duty to acknowledge and to repair where possible. That work of remembering is slow and often incomplete, but it is essential if societies are to learn. Echoes of Victorian asylum logic persist in modern debates about mental health, incarceration, and social care, visible in policies that still favor containment over integration when resources are scarce or political will is thin. Prisons, hospitals, and poorly funded care homes can become modern analogs when economic calculation and political convenience override humane provision. The lesson of the asylums is therefore not merely historical. It is a living warning about how ordinary administrative choices can produce extraordinary harm. Vigilance, transparency, and community investment are required to prevent repeat patterns of warehousing vulnerability. At the same time, the stories of resistance and reform offer hope. Caregivers, relatives, and activists have shown that change is possible when persistent witnesses demand it. Remembering the past thus becomes a tool for shaping a more compassionate present, insisting that dignity and rights guide decisions rather than the quiet arithmetic of convenience.